Story number 1.
I remember the house we moved into. It wasn't much, a modest two-story place on the outskirts of a small town. The kind of house you don't notice unless you're looking for it. There were woods behind it, dense and dark, with a creek that ran through the trees. At first, it seemed like the perfect place for a family with young kids. The yard was big enough for us to run around, and the woods seemed like an endless adventure waiting to be had. I was 12 when we moved there. My younger brother, Sean, was 8. We were close, always running around together, causing trouble. Our parents were busy with the move, so we quickly learned to entertain ourselves. The backyard was a vast expanse of untamed land, bordered by a few tall oaks and the start of the forest. The treehouse was something my father had built for us before we even moved in. It was in one of the largest oak trees in the yard, its branches reaching high into the sky. The treehouse wasn't very big, just a small wooden platform with a makeshift ladder that we'd climb up and down at our leisure. The first few days were full of excitement. Sean and I spent hours in that treehouse, pretending we were pirates, explorers, or secret agents. We'd bring snacks, comics, and toys up there, making it our little hideaway. It was a great spot to escape the monotony of the house and just be kids. My parents thought it was harmless fun. They were wrong. There was something strange about the treehouse. It wasn't just the fact that it was old, or that it had been built by someone who didn't know what they were doing. The platform creaked with every step we took, and the walls were covered in marks, scratches, and carvings we hadn't made ourselves. But the most unsettling thing was the feeling we got when we were up there. Sometimes it felt like we weren't alone. It was as if someone or something was watching us from the woods. Sean and I often had the same feeling, though we didn't talk about it much. He was younger than me, and I didn't want him to get scared, but sometimes I'd feel a cold chill run down my spine for no reason, even on the warmest days. It would only last for a second, but it was enough to make me feel like I needed to leave. One day after school, Sean and I decided to climb up into the treehouse to spend some time there before dinner. It was a little later than usual, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. We didn't think much of it. After all, we had spent countless afternoons up there. But that day was different. I was the first one to climb up. I made my way up the shaky ladder, calling out to Sean as I reached the top. I turned around and waited for him, but he didn't follow me immediately. "Sean," I called, peering over the side of the platform. He didn't respond. I waited a little longer, my patience wearing thin. "Come on, Sean. Don't be a baby," I said, trying to sound playful. Still, no answer. Finally, I heard a rustle behind me, followed by a soft, shuffling sound. I turned around, expecting to see Sean climbing up the ladder, but there was no one there. I felt my stomach tighten, and for the first time I felt that unmistakable sensation that something was wrong. I looked around the treehouse, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner, but it was just the usual, old wooden walls and the debris from our last visit. "Sean?" I called again, but there was still no answer. I decided to climb back down, thinking he might be fooling around at the base of the tree. But as soon as I reached the bottom, I felt a sharp tug on my shirt, pulling me back up. I gasped, spinning around, but no one was there. There was no one at the bottom of the tree either. Confused and shaken, I hurried back up into the treehouse, my heart racing. It was then that I noticed something strange. The carved symbols on the walls were different from the ones we had drawn ourselves. These were darker, more intricate. They almost seemed to shimmer in the dying light as though they were alive. I shook my head, trying to brush off the creeping dread settling in my stomach. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overtired from the day. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It came from behind me, faint and far too quiet to be anyone in the house. I spun around, my eyes scanning the corners of the treehouse. The whispering continued, growing louder, more distinct. I froze. The voice wasn't speaking English. It was in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded ancient, guttural. I felt my skin go cold. "Sean?" I called out again, my voice trembling. "Please, stop messing around." But then there was no answer. The whispering stopped. A silence fell over the treehouse, so thick I could feel it in my chest. It was then that I saw it. In the farthest corner of the treehouse, there was a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the way the light was hitting the walls. But as I focused on it, I realized the shadow wasn't part of the tree or the walls. It was standing there. I couldn't see its features, but I knew it was there. It was like a black void, too dark for the natural light to touch. The air around it seemed to distort, warping the space as if something was pushing against the world itself. My heart was pounding in my chest. Every instinct in me screamed to get out. I started to climb down, but as soon as I placed my foot on the ladder, I heard a thud, a heavy thud, like something large had just landed on the platform. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The shadow had moved. I could hear its breath now, slow and shallow, just behind me. The last thing I remember was a hand, reaching out from the darkness, gripping the edge of the treehouse. My scream caught in my throat, my legs giving out from beneath me as I stumbled down the ladder, landing hard on the ground below. I don't remember how I got back to the house, but I know that I didn't go back to that treehouse. Not for a long time. Sean never came down after that. He disappeared. The search for him lasted for days. Our parents, the neighbors, the whole town, everyone came out looking for him, but no one found any trace of him. The police thought he had run away, but I knew better. I knew that whatever I had seen in the treehouse had taken him. The whispers, the shadow, the hand that reached out, none of it was in my head. It was real. I never told anyone about the treehouse, not about the symbols, not about the shadow, not about the whispering voices. No one would have believed me. They found Sean's shoes at the base of the tree, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Eventually, they stopped looking, and life moved on. But I never forgot what happened that day. Every now and then, when I walk past that part of the woods, I feel the same unease in my chest, the same sense of being watched. I know that the treehouse is still there, hidden in the woods, waiting for someone else to find it. I just hope no one does. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I don't know if it was the way the wind would howl through the trees or the way the branches would creak under the weight of the years, but there was always something about our treehouse that felt off. At first, it was just a place for my younger sister and me to play. My dad built it for us one summer, high up in a sturdy oak tree that towered over the rest of our yard. We spent hours up there, reading books, playing make-believe, and daydreaming in our little wooden sanctuary. It was supposed to be a perfect escape, a place where we could feel safe and free. But as time went on, that feeling began to slip away. I never told anyone what happened up there. I'm not sure why. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe I was scared that if I spoke it out loud, it would somehow make it worse. But the truth is, something happened that summer, something that changed everything about how I saw that treehouse and what was lurking around it. It started when I was about 14. I had always been the adventurous one, the one who would climb higher, go further, and explore the edges of the woods behind our house. My sister, Lila, was only 10, so she wasn't as interested in climbing trees and exploring like I was. I would spend hours in the treehouse by myself, reading or just thinking. But one day, something was different. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. I was up in the treehouse, sitting by the small window, looking out over the woods. I had just finished reading a book and was about to head down when I heard something. A faint sound, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. It sounded like someone walking on the ground below the treehouse. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, the woods were full of animals. Maybe it was just a deer or some other creature moving through the brush. But the sound didn't stop. It came closer, and the distinct crunching of footsteps on dry leaves seemed to draw near to the base of the tree. I stood up, looking out the window, expecting to see one of the neighbors walking through the yard, maybe taking a shortcut through the trees. But there was no one there. The yard was empty, and the woods stretched out in all directions, silent and still. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing. A trick of the wind, maybe. But as I turned to head back toward the ladder, I heard it again, this time much closer. A faint tapping sound, as if someone was tapping on the wooden walls of the treehouse. I froze. My heart raced. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. There was no one up here. No one else could have climbed the ladder without me hearing it. The tapping continued, faint but insistent, as though something or someone was gently knocking on the walls, just out of sight. I leaned closer to the wall, my breath catching in my throat, listening intently. The tapping stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the noise had been. I turned to climb down the ladder, my hands shaking slightly, but when I reached the bottom, I stopped. I looked up at the treehouse, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from the window. But there was nothing. That night I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about what I had heard up there. The tapping, the footsteps, it all felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. It didn't seem like a normal animal or a breeze playing tricks on me. It felt deliberate, almost purposeful. The next day I went back up to the treehouse. I was determined to find out if there was some explanation for what had happened. As I climbed the ladder, I felt a cold draft brush against my skin, though the day was warm. I shivered, but tried to ignore it. When I reached the top, I noticed that something was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the treehouse itself was holding its breath. The floorboards, which had always been solid, creaked ominously beneath my weight. But it wasn't the wood that made me pause. It was the smell. There was something strange in the air, something musty and sour, like the scent of wet earth, but sharper, more pungent. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stepped farther into the treehouse. The smell seemed to be coming from the corner where we had always kept a small stash of blankets and pillows. I had never noticed it before. I knelt down to investigate, and as I lifted a pillow to check beneath it, I froze. The space under the pillow was empty. No, not empty. It was covered in dirt. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. I had no idea how or why the dirt had appeared, but it was there, a thick layer of it, as if something had been buried underneath the treehouse. The dirt wasn't just in the corner either. It was scattered across the floor, as though something had been digging around. I quickly stood up, my hands trembling. What in the world was going on? That's when I heard it again, the same faint tapping sound, now coming from behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there. But once again, there was nothing. No one. I couldn't stay up there any longer. I scrambled down the ladder, not caring about being quiet or careful. I ran back to the house, my mind racing. I didn't tell my parents about what I had found. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't even tell Lila. I kept it to myself, even though it haunted me for days. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I couldn't go near the treehouse without feeling a sense of dread. The noises continued. Footsteps in the woods, tapping on the walls, and the smell of earth and decay in the air. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the walls of the house, though no one else seemed to hear it. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. It felt like something was there, something that didn't want us in that treehouse anymore. One afternoon, after weeks of trying to push it all out of my mind, I decided to take Lila with me. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe, just maybe, it would be different with her there. We climbed up together, my hands shaking as I helped her onto the ladder. When we reached the top, the air was thick, just like it had been before. But this time I noticed something else. The small window we had always left open was now shut. The wooden planks were sealed tight, as if someone had intentionally closed it. I hadn't touched it, neither had Lila, but there it was, closed without explanation. I tried to ignore the rising sense of panic in my chest. Lila was already making herself comfortable in the corner, as if nothing was wrong. She was always the brave one, the one who didn't let anything faze her. I envied that about her. But then, as we sat in the treehouse, the tapping started again, louder this time, and then the scratching, faint but persistent, from below. Lila didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't want to, but I could feel the weight of it, the eyes that I was certain were watching us from the shadows of the trees, the sense that something was waiting, biding its time. We didn't stay long. We left the treehouse in a hurry, climbing down as fast as we could. As we reached the ground, I turned back one last time, and that's when I saw it. Just for a split second, in the small window, a figure, a shadow, standing still, watching us. I couldn't make out the details, but it was enough. We never went back to the treehouse after that. My parents eventually decided to move, not because of the treehouse, but because of other circumstances. We left the house and the treehouse behind. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the tapping, the scratching, and I can feel the weight of whatever was lurking there, just waiting for someone to notice. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I've always had a thing for old houses and forgotten places. Those parts of the world that seem to hold a secret just waiting to be discovered. That's why when we moved to my uncle's farm when I was 12, I found myself endlessly exploring the large patch of woods behind the house. The farmhouse was old, built in the 1800s and surrounded by a mixture of fields and dense trees. It was the kind of place that felt alive with history, the kind of place you could get lost in. But there was one thing that kept my curiosity buzzing, even on days when the woods felt heavy with stillness: the treehouse. It wasn't much to look at from a distance, just a small wooden platform up in a towering oak tree, high enough that the leaves blocked most of the sun. The treehouse had been there long before we moved in, probably even before my uncle had bought the property. Its walls were cracked, and a thick layer of vines had wrapped themselves around the wood, making it seem even older than it was. From the ground, it looked abandoned and forgotten, a relic of another time. I remember the first time I mentioned it to my uncle, just casually asking if anyone used it. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me for a moment too long, his face a mix of concern and something else, something I couldn't place. "It's been years since anyone went up there," he said, his voice tight. "You're welcome to check it out, but be careful. That tree's old and so is the platform. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you." It was strange how he'd said it, like he was almost warning me without exactly warning me. It left a lingering discomfort in my chest, but as any curious 12-year-old would, I didn't think much of it. The next Saturday, my younger brother Will and I decided to check it out. I had no idea why, but I had this pull toward it, like there was something I needed to find up there. We grabbed a ladder from the barn, pushed it against the trunk of the oak tree, and began to climb. The ladder creaked under our weight, but we made it to the top. I pulled myself up onto the platform and then helped Will up. The treehouse smelled damp, like old wood and mildew. The floorboards were uneven, some of them cracked and broken, with gaps that let sunlight filter through. There were small piles of leaves and dirt scattered around, remnants of animals or wind, and a few old objects scattered around. Things that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A rusted tin can, a frayed rope, a few old toys. But it wasn't the mess that caught my attention. It was the thing in the corner. At first, I didn't see it. It blended into the shadows. But as I moved around, I noticed something odd. A small wooden chest. It was half buried beneath the dirt and debris, tucked behind an old, rotting chair. I don't know why, but I felt this overwhelming urge to approach it. "Hey, Will, look at this," I called to my brother. He walked over, standing next to me, his face a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. "Is it locked?" Will asked, his voice low. I crouched down beside the chest and felt around the surface. It was heavy, too heavy for its size, and the wood had dark, deep grooves carved into it. I found a small latch and flicked it open. The lid creaked as it opened, revealing what looked like a bundle of old, weathered clothes. They were stacked carefully, almost as if someone had placed them there on purpose, and there was something about the way they were arranged that made me uneasy. The chest was deeper than I expected, and as I reached inside to pull the clothes out, my hand brushed something cold and metallic. I pulled back immediately. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to race. I wasn't sure what I had touched, but it didn't feel right. Will, sensing my unease, leaned in. "What is it?" he asked. I didn't respond right away. I had this sinking feeling, like something was off, but I couldn't quite place it. I opened the chest further, pushing aside the clothes, and my fingers brushed against something smooth. I pulled it out and held it up. It was a small old knife. The handle was intricately carved, and the blade, though rusted, was still sharp to the touch. There was a strange symbol etched into the side, one I didn't recognize, and a layer of dirt and grime had built up over the years. I didn't know why, but I felt an immediate sense of dread. "We should leave," I said quickly, my voice unsteady. Will was already backing away, his face pale. "Yeah, I don't like this," he murmured. I didn't argue. We left the treehouse immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to find. As we climbed down, I glanced back at the treehouse. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow or a movement in the window. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the knife, its strange markings kept playing in my mind, and that feeling of being watched. It lingered, and I couldn't shake it. In the morning, I decided to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't help myself. I had to know more. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I grabbed the same ladder and went back to the treehouse, determined to figure out what was really going on. But when I got to the platform, something was different. The chest was gone. It wasn't just moved or knocked over. It was gone. I searched the entire treehouse, every corner, but there was no sign of it. Even the small pile of dirt and leaves where I had found it had been swept away. Everything in the treehouse looked as though it had been untouched for years, except for the empty space where the chest had been. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the bare spot, trying to make sense of what had happened. But then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that I could hear it over the wind rustling the leaves. Leave. I froze. It was coming from below, from the trees. I peered over the edge of the platform, but there was nothing there. The woods were still, silent. I climbed down quickly, my heart racing. As I landed on the ground, I could feel something watching me. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't look back as I ran toward the house, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. That was the last time I ever went near the treehouse. Days later, when I mentioned it to my uncle, he just shook his head, a grim look crossing his face. "I told you to be careful," he muttered, his voice low. Some things in those woods are better left alone. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't elaborate. He just told me that the treehouse had been there long before we arrived and that no one had ever spoken of it again after my father and his brothers left. But I never forgot that feeling. The feeling that something was there, watching. And to this day, when I pass by the woods, I can't help but glance toward the oak tree, half expecting to see a shadow moving in the window. Some things I've learned are never meant to be found, and some things just don't want to be forgotten. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
When I was young, my parents decided to move to a small, quiet town on the edge of a forest. The house was old, built in the 1920s, with creaky floorboards and a large yard that seemed to stretch on forever. My brother and I were excited by the space and freedom, especially the woods that bordered our property. It felt like the perfect place for adventure, and I couldn't wait to explore. One afternoon, when I was around 11, my dad decided to build us a treehouse in one of the tallest oak trees at the edge of our yard. I had always wanted a treehouse, and my brother, who was a few years older, was just as excited as I was. It didn't take long for my dad to get started, and soon we had a small but sturdy structure nestled high in the tree's branches. It was nothing fancy, just a wooden platform with a roof, some old blankets, and a rope ladder that led up to it. For a while, the treehouse became our little hideaway. We'd spend hours up there reading, playing games, and pretending we were explorers in a jungle or pirates on the high seas. The view from the treehouse was incredible. From there, we could see the entire backyard, the fields beyond, and the forest stretching into the distance. It felt safe, like our own private world, far away from the everyday worries. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice something strange about that treehouse. It wasn't the structure itself or anything physical. It was more of a feeling. It was subtle at first, like a sense that something was off. I started to feel uneasy every time I climbed the rope ladder to get to the top. It wasn't just the height that bothered me. It was something in the air, a strange energy that seemed to hang around the treehouse. At first, I thought it was my imagination. After all, I was just a kid and my mind often played tricks on me. But things started to happen that I couldn't explain. One evening, I was up in the treehouse by myself. My brother had already gone inside for dinner, and I stayed behind, hoping to finish a book I had been reading. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and the air had started to cool. I was sitting near the edge of the treehouse, looking out over the field, when I heard something. It was a faint noise at first, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. I turned, thinking my brother had returned or that maybe one of the neighbors was nearby, but there was no one in sight. I shook it off and went back to reading, but then the whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and it didn't sound like anyone I knew. It was just a low murmur, as though someone was standing just below the treehouse, speaking softly. I stood up, my heart racing, and looked down through the branches. The yard was empty, and the woods were still, not a leaf moving. I called out to my brother, but no answer came. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving behind a heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt a chill run through me, and for the first time, I didn't want to be in that treehouse. I climbed down quickly, my hands trembling, and ran inside, my book forgotten. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about the whispering, the way it seemed to come from nowhere, and the way it had stopped when I looked down. It felt as though something had been watching me, waiting for me to hear it. The next few days, I tried to go back to the treehouse, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My brother had noticed my change in behavior and asked me if something was wrong, but I didn't tell him. I didn't want to sound foolish or scared. It wasn't until he started to act strange himself that I knew something wasn't right. One afternoon, my brother and I were both up in the treehouse playing a game of cards. The sun was high in the sky and the warm breeze made the branches sway gently. But then, without warning, the air seemed to grow colder. My brother, who had always been the braver of the two of us, stopped mid-move and looked around. He had a strange look on his face, one that I had never seen before. His eyes were wide, his body tense. "Do you hear that?" he asked in a whisper. I froze, immediately on edge. My brother's voice sounded different, like he was scared. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer, but instead motioned toward the corner of the treehouse, the same place where I had felt the unease before. The whispering started again, but this time it was clearer. The voices were low but distinct, like muffled conversations happening just out of reach. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but all I could hear were fragmented syllables. It was as though the voices were too far away, or they were being carried by the wind just beyond the edge of hearing. I stood up, my heart pounding. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But my brother didn't move. He stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the corner of the treehouse, his expression one of both fear and fascination. I tried to pull him away, but he resisted. "I want to see," he muttered, almost to himself. "Maybe we should stay. Maybe we can." Before he could finish, the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. It felt like everything in the treehouse had gone still, like the very air around us was holding its breath. And then, just as quickly as it had stopped, the temperature dropped, and we both felt it. A presence, something heavy in the air, like the weight of 1,000 eyes staring at us from the darkness. I could see my breath misting in the cold air, and I knew we had to leave. I grabbed my brother's arm and pulled him toward the ladder. He resisted at first, still staring at the corner of the treehouse, but eventually he followed me down, his face pale and his hands shaking. We ran back to the house, but neither of us spoke a word. We didn't need to. The terror of what we had felt up there was enough to keep us both silent. After that day, we avoided the treehouse altogether. We didn't tell our parents what had happened, afraid that they would dismiss our fears as childish imagination. But we knew the truth. Something was wrong with that treehouse. The voices, the presence, it wasn't something we could explain away. Weeks passed, and we slowly began to forget the fear that had gripped us. But then, one day, my brother found something in the treehouse. He had gone up there alone, determined to face whatever it was that had frightened us so much. He didn't tell me until later that evening, when I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a small, crumpled piece of paper in his hand. It was a note, handwritten in what appeared to be smudged ink. The handwriting was strange, almost as if it had been written in a hurry or under duress. He unfolded the paper, and I read the words aloud. "Get out now. It's too late." My blood ran cold as I looked at my brother. His face was ashen, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He had never been the type to scare easily, but now I could see the terror that had taken hold of him. We never went back to the treehouse after that. My brother refused to even look at it from the yard, and I stayed away as well. We didn't talk about it to our parents, and over time, the memory of the treehouse faded. But every now and then, when I stand in the yard, I can feel a chill in the air, and I wonder if something still lingers there, waiting for someone else to discover it. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It all started with a simple conversation. One of those late-night talks you have with friends when you're bored and the adrenaline of the day has worn off. I had just moved to a small town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. It was an old town, settled along winding roads with old houses tucked in behind thickets of woods, the kind of place where the trees grew thick and gnarled, almost alive. There was something about this place that made you feel like it was watching you, especially at night. It wasn't the kind of place where anything exciting would happen, yet there was something dark under the surface, waiting to be unearthed. It was the summer I turned 13. I met a kid named Evan, who seemed to be a few years older than me. He was quiet, but there was something magnetic about him that made people want to follow him. Maybe it was because he was always on the move, always in control of the situation, even when nobody quite understood what was going on. Evan's family had lived in the area for generations, and their house was the oldest one on the block. A large Victorian that creaked at night and looked like it belonged in a ghost story. It was the kind of house you'd stay away from if you knew what was good for you. One evening, Evan invited me over to his place. He said he wanted to show me something, a secret his family had kept for years. I remember the way his eyes lit up when he mentioned it. It was clear he had been dying to share this with someone. "You're gonna love it," Evan said, a grin spreading across his face. "Love what?" I asked, the curiosity getting the better of me. "You'll see," he replied cryptically, leading me out the back door and into the woods behind his house. The trees were dense, their branches thick and twisted, blocking out much of the evening light. As we walked deeper into the forest, I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, the rustling of creatures in the underbrush, and the occasional bird calling out from the treetops. The air smelled fresh, but there was an undertone of decay, like the forest was holding on to secrets that didn't want to be found. We walked for what seemed like miles, following a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the woods. I began to feel uneasy, the forest growing darker and more oppressive the further we went. The sounds of nature seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Evan, however, didn't seem to notice. He moved with a purpose, as if he had been here 1,000 times before. Finally, we reached a clearing, and that's when I saw it. The treehouse. It was perched high in the branches of an ancient oak, its wooden planks worn and faded with age. The rope ladder that led up to it was frayed, barely holding on to the tree. From the ground, it looked like something straight out of a nightmare. The structure seemed fragile, as though one wrong move could send it crashing down. And yet, it wasn't the physical condition of the treehouse that unsettled me. It was the feeling I got when I looked at it. It felt like it was waiting for something, watching. "Is this what you wanted to show me?" I asked, my voice shaky as I took a step forward. Evan nodded, his grin widening. "This is where it all started." "What do you mean?" "You'll see," he said again, climbing up the rope ladder with ease, his feet barely making a sound as he ascended. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the treehouse. Something about it made me feel like I shouldn't be there. Like something was wrong, and I was about to uncover it whether I wanted to or not. But Evan's voice called down from above. "You coming up or what?" Against my better judgment, I followed him up the ladder, my hands gripping the ropes tightly. The higher I climbed, the more I felt like I was leaving the real world behind, entering a place where the rules didn't apply. When I reached the top, Evan was already inside the treehouse, waiting for me. It was small, barely enough room for the two of us. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and there were holes in the walls where the wood had rotted away. I could see the forest stretching out beneath us, the trees forming a dense canopy that shielded the ground from the light. There was an unsettling stillness up here, as if time had stopped. "What is this place?" I asked, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping over me. "This is where my brother and I used to come," Evan said, his voice softening. Before he disappeared. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What happened?" Evan sat down on a weathered bench that was nailed to the wall, his gaze distant. "We used to come up here all the time. It was our secret place, a place where we could get away from everything. But then one day, he went up alone. I was supposed to meet him here, but I never did. He was gone. Just like that." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, gone? What happened to him?" Evan didn't answer right away. He just stared at the floor as though the words were too painful to speak. "They never found him. The cops searched the woods for days, but there was no sign of him. It was like he just vanished. And my parents, they never wanted to talk about it. But I know he's still here. Somewhere." I looked around the treehouse, suddenly feeling like the walls were closing in. There was something unsettling about the way Evan spoke. Like he believed what he was saying, but I didn't know if I did. "Are you sure it wasn't just an accident?" I asked, trying to rationalize the situation. Evan looked up at me, his eyes dark. "I've been up here 100 times since then. I've heard things. Whispers. Footsteps. I don't think he left, not really. He's still here. Watching." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked around the treehouse, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But then, as if on cue, I heard it, a creak. The sound of wood bending under pressure, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, light but deliberate, moving across the wooden floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Evan's eyes were wide with recognition, and he stood up abruptly. "I told you," he whispered. "He's still here." Before I could respond, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving across the far wall of the treehouse. It was tall, human-shaped, but there was something wrong about it. It was as though it didn't belong. I turned to Evan, but he was staring at the shadow, his face pale and stricken with fear. "It's him," he said, his voice trembling. "He's come back." In that moment, I realized we weren't alone. There was something in the treehouse with us, something that shouldn't have been there. The shadow seemed to grow larger, more defined, until it was standing right behind us. And then, without warning, the treehouse lurched violently. The walls rattled, and the floorboards creaked, as though the entire structure was about to collapse. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the edge, but Evan grabbed my arm just in time. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, my voice rising in panic, but Evan didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the shadow, his face frozen in terror. "It's too late," he whispered. "He's not going to let us leave." The treehouse rocked again, the towers, and I felt myself losing my balance. I grabbed the ladder, but before I could climb down, a hand grabbed my wrist, cold and clammy. I looked up to see Evan's face, his expression twisted in fear. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now we're both trapped." I tried to pull away, but the grip on my wrist tightened. The shadow in the corner of the treehouse moved closer, its features becoming clearer, though it was still shrouded in darkness. I screamed, but no sound came out. I felt my body being dragged toward the edge of the platform, the ground below spinning as the treehouse groaned under the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I woke up on the forest floor, my head pounding and my body sore. The treehouse was gone. The oak tree stood tall and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Something had changed. Something had followed me back. Evan was never seen again. And the treehouse? It's still there, hidden deep in the woods. Every now and then, when the wind is right, I can hear the whispers. I've never gone back. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was one of those places that you almost didn't notice when you passed it, if not for the occasional creak of the branches swaying or the unnerving sound of something scraping against wood in the dead of night. Nestled deep within the thick forest, the old treehouse had been there for as long as anyone could remember. It was a relic, an abandoned playhouse long forgotten by the world. Nobody knew who built it or when. The locals always spoke of it in hushed tones, and the kids from the nearby town learned quickly that there were some places in the woods you just didn't go. It wasn't out of fear of getting lost or even encountering wildlife. No, it was something far worse. Something that would make you regret ever setting foot in those woods. It was a story I grew up hearing, the kind of tale passed down like a warning. My own brother, Jake, was the one who dared to disprove it. A firm skeptic, he scoffed at the old stories, convinced they were nothing more than the exaggerated musings of superstitious country folk. When he came to visit me that summer, after I had moved away from home, he was determined to put an end to the rumors once and for all. The treehouse had been a fixture of my childhood, a place where I had played endlessly with friends. But that was before I knew, before I truly understood the weight of the place. It all started one lazy afternoon when Jake and I were hiking through the woods. I had grown up here, and despite the eerie stories, there was something about these woods that felt comforting to me, like they were an old friend. But that day, there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The birds weren't chirping, and the wind had stopped moving the branches. Jake had been telling me in that mocking tone of his about how absurd the treehouse stories were. "It's just a treehouse," he'd said. "Who knows why people still make a big deal about it?" I'd only shrugged in response, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. I wasn't sure what it was, but something about that treehouse had always unsettled me. "You're seriously not still buying into that nonsense, are you?" Jake laughed, nudging me with his elbow. "You've always been the paranoid one, huh?" I didn't respond. The woods were too quiet. Even the sound of our footsteps on the dried leaves seemed to echo louder than usual. Finally, we reached the clearing, the very spot where the treehouse stood. There it was, as if it hadn't changed in years. The structure loomed over us, suspended high in a massive oak, its wooden planks now warped and splintering with age. The treehouse looked abandoned, desolate, and yet there was something off about it. It wasn't just the decay, but the way the branches twisted around it like claws, almost as if the tree itself were holding it hostage. Jake rolled his eyes. "See? No big deal. A little creepy, sure, but it's just some old wood. People make it sound like it's cursed or something." I watched him approach the base of the tree, his curiosity pushing him forward despite my reluctance. "Wait, Jake," I said, my voice unsteady. "We shouldn't go up there. The wood is rotting. It's unsafe." But he wasn't listening. He already had one foot on the first rung of the ladder. "You're paranoid," he said again. "I'm going up. Stay down here if you want." He climbed quickly, his confidence and defiance of the dark feeling creeping up my spine. I stood at the base of the tree, half staring up as he disappeared into the shadows above. The air felt colder. The branches began to creak louder than usual, but I told myself it was just the wind. "Jake?" I called up after him. "Are you sure about this?" There was no answer. I waited, feeling a strange tension settle over me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a faint noise, soft and distant at first. "Jake?" I called again. Then a rustle. The noise grew louder, closer. I was about to call out to him again when I heard it, a voice, a whisper. It wasn't Jake's voice. I froze. The whisper sounded like it was coming from above, just beyond the treehouse, but it didn't make any sense. The wind wasn't blowing, there were no animals, just that eerie sound, faint but unmistakable. And then, suddenly, there was a loud crash from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of Jake shouting in pain. "Get off! Get off of me!" he yelled. I sprinted toward the tree, my heart pounding. "Jake!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. There was no response. I reached the bottom of the ladder and hesitated for a second, staring up into the darkness above. A strange force seemed to pull at my feet, like something invisible was trying to keep me from climbing. But I had no choice. I grabbed the ladder and started my ascent, my hands shaking with fear. By the time I reached the top, I saw him. Jake was lying on the floor of the treehouse, his eyes wide with terror. He was gasping for air, his face pale as though he had seen something that had frozen him to the bone. I knelt beside him, shaking him gently. "Jake, what happened? What did you see?" He looked up at me with wild, terrified eyes. It's here. It was in the house." I glanced around the treehouse, but it was empty. The room was a disordered mess, as expected for a place long abandoned. There was no one here. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "There's nothing here." Jake's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with a strength I hadn't expected from him. "You don't get it, do you? There's something in the house. It's not just a treehouse. It's alive." The words sent a chill down my spine. Alive? What was he talking about? Before I could ask another question, I heard it, a scraping noise, just above us, like something sharp dragging across the floorboards. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up. There was nothing there. Jake's grip tightened. "We need to get out of here now." But it was too late. From the darkness above, something shifted. A figure, no, a shape, dropped down from the rafters, landing in the corner with a sound that was far too soft for a human form. The shape was hunched, its arms long and impossibly thin, draped with shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. I gasped and stumbled backward, pulling Jake with me. His breathing was erratic, his eyes wide with terror. The shape in the corner didn't move. It just watched, unmoving, its presence heavy and oppressive. I wanted it to run, to flee, but the ladder was behind me, and the treehouse was all around us. There was nowhere to go. Jake turned to me, his voice barely a whisper. "It's been waiting for us all these years, waiting for someone to come." The figure moved then, but not like anything human. Its limbs jerked unnaturally as it scuttled toward us, the scrape of its long nails on the wood echoing in my ears. I screamed, pushing Jake toward the ladder. "Run!" We bolted from the treehouse, clambering down the ladder as fast as we could. But the thing was right behind us, its movements fast and erratic, closing in with every second. By the time we reached the forest floor, the air felt dense and heavy, as if the very trees were pressing in on us. We didn't stop running. We didn't look back. I don't know how far we ran, Ma, but when we finally stopped, gasping for air, we were deep in the woods, far away from the clearing. I turned back, expecting to see the treehouse looming in the distance, but there was nothing. The forest was still, silent. "Jake?" I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his face pale, his eyes hollow. You didn't hear it, did you? The whispers?" I shook my head, confused. "What do you mean?" He was staring off into the distance, lost in thought, his hands shaking. "It's been there for years, waiting. It doesn't let people go." We never went back to that treehouse, and we never spoke of it again, but I can still hear the whispers sometimes when the wind is right, and sometimes I hear scratching sounds at my door. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be just a simple family weekend getaway. A quiet escape to the countryside, far from the noise of the city. My cousins, my younger brother, and I had heard of an old treehouse that had once been a children's playhouse. Abandoned for years, but still standing in the woods behind my uncle's cabin. The whole thing felt like an adventure, the kind of thing you only read about in old ghost stories or watch on late-night TV. But I didn't realize then that we weren't the first to discover the treehouse. We weren't the first to come across it, and we wouldn't be the last either. It was a Saturday afternoon when we decided to explore. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the sprawling forest that surrounded the cabin. My cousin Emily, the oldest among us, was the first to suggest we go up to the treehouse. "Why not? It'll be fun," she said, grinning widely. It had always been her idea of fun to push the boundaries, to challenge the rest of us to do something reckless. "You can go, but I'm not going in that thing," my younger brother Max said, already making excuses. He was 12, and in his mind, the treehouse was definitely haunted by something sinister. "It's old, and it looks like it could fall apart any minute. Plus, I've heard stories." "Stories? About what?" Emily raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Max just shrugged. "You know, the usual. People disappearing, voices, the usual creepy stuff. I'm not going." I rolled my eyes, but secretly agreed with him. The treehouse looked incredibly eerie from where I stood, perched on the edge of a massive oak tree, its wooden walls rotting away in places. Vines crawled up the sides, and the roof looked unstable, as if it could collapse at any moment. But I didn't want to seem scared, not in front of my cousins. "I'm going up," I said, pretending to be braver than I really felt. Emily nodded approvingly, and my younger cousin Leo, always eager to please, followed suit. Max stayed behind, grumbling under his breath. The climb was harder than I expected. The treehouse had been neglected for years. Its wooden steps were uneven, and some were missing entirely. But after a few minutes of awkwardly scrambling, we reached the small platform at the top. The view from up there was breathtaking. Thick green foliage stretched for miles, and the forest seemed to go on forever. The treehouse itself, however, was a different story. It was small, dark, and smelled of mildew and decay. Inside, we found the remnants of what once might have been a playroom. Shattered windows, old toys scattered across the floor, and walls covered in peeling wallpaper. Dust hung in the air, and the faintest trace of something strange lingered in the atmosphere. Emily, always the brave one, immediately began exploring, opening creaky drawers and looking through forgotten objects. "This place is so cool," she called out excitedly. Leo followed her, peeking into corners, picking up broken pieces of toys. I, however, was uneasy. Something felt off about the place. It wasn't just the unsettling atmosphere or the decaying surroundings. It was something deeper, something almost alive. A feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, a sensation of being watched. I decided to sit by the window, looking out over the vast expanse of trees. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I noticed it, a strange movement in the woods below. A figure, just outside the edge of the trees. It wasn't clear at first, just a vague silhouette against the darkening woods. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey, you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What?" Emily replied, not bothering to look away from her exploration. "That figure, down there by the trees. It looks like someone's standing there." At that, Emily glanced outside, followed by Leo. For a moment, we all stared in silence, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The figure was still there, unmoving, just standing there in the shadows. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. "It's probably just an animal," Leo said, but his voice wasn't as certain as he probably hoped it sounded. He didn't look convinced. But I wasn't so sure. It wasn't the shape of an animal, not by a long shot. It was too tall, too humanoid. And why had it vanished so quickly? I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Let's go back down," I said. "This place is too creepy." Emily shrugged. "Come on, we've barely seen anything yet. What's the worst that could happen?" But I had a feeling that the worst had already begun. I couldn't explain it, but I felt something watching me. Not just from the woods, but from inside the treehouse itself. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards creaking underfoot as if the house was alive, waiting. "Let's check the upstairs," Emily suggested, unbothered by the strange sense of foreboding I was feeling. She headed up a rickety staircase that led to a small, darkened loft. Leo followed her, but I hesitated. I looked out of the window again, scanning the woods below, half expecting to see that figure reappear. When I didn't, I turned back to follow them. But as I did, something caught my eye. A faint, soft whisper coming from somewhere within the treehouse. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. No answer. I glanced up the staircase to see if Emily or Leo had made any noise. They hadn't. They were still on the loft, their heads barely visible from the opening at the top of the stairs. The whisper was almost imperceptible, a voice too soft to make out, but I could feel it, like it was speaking directly into my mind. The air grew colder. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. But curiosity and the need to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things pushed me to the top of the stairs. I felt the weight of the darkness around me, pressing in as I reached the top of the small loft. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not a person, at least not in any sense. It was a shape, a shadow, but not just any shadow. Its edges were blurred, as if it didn't belong to the physical world. It stood in the corner of the loft, near an old rocking chair that creaked slightly, as though it had just been disturbed. I froze, my eyes locked on the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel it staring at me, its presence filling the entire space. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. And then I heard it again, the whisper, louder this time. "Get out!" The voice was raspy, like it had been trapped in the treehouse for years, maybe decades. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran down the stairs, practically stumbling over myself in my desperation to get away from whatever that thing was. Emily and Leo were already at the bottom of the stairs, looking at me in confusion. "What happened?" Emily asked, her tone dismissive. "There's something in there," I gasped. "Something. Not right." But before they could respond, the air around us seemed to change. The treehouse creaked violently, as though it were about to collapse. The temperature dropped, and a sharp, sudden wind howled through the trees, shaking the entire structure. It felt like the treehouse itself was alive, angry, or perhaps even warning us to leave. "Let's get out of here," I said, pulling on Emily's arm. "Now." We scrambled down the steps, Leo right behind us. As we hit the ground, I turned for one last glance at the treehouse, and that's when I saw it. The figure, no longer in the loft, was standing in the doorway watching us. I could feel my blood run cold. We didn't stop to think. We ran as fast as we could through the dense woods back toward the cabin. We didn't speak as we ran, and we didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. When we finally reached the cabin, breathless and terrified, we slammed the door shut behind us. We didn't dare venture back into the woods that night or for the rest of the weekend. We stayed inside, not speaking of what had happened, but knowing we had seen something that didn't belong in this world. The treehouse was never mentioned again, and to this day I wonder if it was ever meant to be found, or if we were just the latest in a long line of visitors who never made it out quite the same. Story the end.
Story number 8.
When I was a kid, I was obsessed with tree houses. There was something magical about them. A secret world high above the ground, away from the eyes of adults, a place where you could create your own rules and live out your fantasies. My parents, recognizing my growing interest, decided to indulge me and build a tree house in our backyard. It was tucked in a large oak tree, hidden from view by thick branches. I remember spending countless hours there, reading, daydreaming, and imagining. It became my personal sanctuary. But little did I know that treehouse would become the site of something I would never be able to forget. The trouble began one summer evening when I was about 12. It was a warm, sticky night, the kind where the air seems to cling to you. I was in the treehouse, sitting with my best friend Jason. We were playing cards, the soft rustling of the leaves, the only sound that filled the air. Our parents were inside the house, the occasional murmur of conversation drifting in from below. Then, something unusual happened. A sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the wind didn't have a voice like that. It was faint, almost like something scraping against the bark of the tree. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a squirrel or some other animal, and continued with my game. But the noise came again, louder this time. I looked at Jason, who had stopped moving and was staring at the treehouse ladder with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. I felt that strange prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the kind that only comes when something feels off. It wasn't the wind. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't about to leave the treehouse to check. Not at night. Jason was the more adventurous of the two of us, and after a few moments of silence, he stood up and peered over the edge of the platform, trying to look down into the shadows below. "It's probably nothing," he said, though I could tell by the tremor in his voice that he wasn't sure either. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the noise coming sporadically, each time a little closer, until finally it stopped altogether. The air around us grew thick with tension, and Jason and I exchanged an uneasy glance. Neither of us was brave enough to leave, but neither of us wanted to stay there either. After what seemed like an eternity, I started to feel ridiculous. It had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a possum, but deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was watching us. It was then that I noticed something strange, a shadow moving under the tree, just beyond the reach of the light from the window in the house. The shadow shifted unnaturally, like it was aware of our presence, but not in the way a normal animal would be. Jason must have seen it too, because he grabbed my arm and whispered urgently, "We need to go inside. Now." I didn't argue. There was something about that shadow that made the hair on my neck stand up, something wrong about it. We hurriedly climbed down the ladder, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as we reached the bottom, I glanced back at the treehouse one last time, and that's when I saw it. A face. Pale, almost ghostly, and staring at me from the window of the treehouse. It was a face that didn't belong there, twisted, with hollow eyes like it had been there for much longer than it should have. I froze, rooted to the spot as the face disappeared behind the wooden wall of the treehouse. "Run!" Jason yelled, pulling me by the arm. We bolted for the door of the house, not stopping until we were inside, where the safety of our parents and the warmth of the lights offered some sense of comfort. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Jason didn't either. We both kept it to ourselves, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the face, about the strange sensation I had when I looked at it, like it wasn't just someone trying to spook us. It was something that had been waiting. The next day, I went back to the treehouse alone. Jason refused to come with me, not after what happened the night before. I climbed the ladder, my palms sweaty, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The treehouse was exactly as it had been before, except for one small detail. The window was cracked open, just a tiny bit. I was sure I had closed it the night before. My stomach twisted with a familiar sense of dread, but I convinced myself that maybe I had forgotten. I tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong and went about the task of cleaning up the treehouse, hoping to regain some sense of normalcy. But that's when I found it. Buried under some old magazines was a small object. It was a rusted, tarnished key. I stared at it for a long time, wondering where it could have come from. I didn't recognize it, and there was no reason for it to be there. I picked it up carefully, running my fingers over its jagged edges. It felt cold, as if it had been there for years. I didn't understand what it was for, but I knew I had to keep it. Something about it felt important. Something told me that it was tied to whatever had been watching us. I stuffed it into my pocket, not knowing that this would be the beginning of a series of events that would haunt me for years to come. Later that week, I decided to return to the treehouse, this time with the key. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even Jason. There was a part of me that was too afraid to explain it. I climbed up, my heart pounding as I approached the window. The key, now warm in my hand, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. It didn't take long for me to realize what the key was for. There was a small latch on the inside of the treehouse, hidden behind a rotting piece of wood. I hadn't noticed it before, but when I slid the key into the latch, it turned with an unsettling ease. The panel in the wall creaked open. Inside the wall, there was a small compartment. At first, I thought it would be empty, but when I peered inside, I saw a small bundle wrapped in old cloth. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled it out. It was a collection of photographs, black and white, old, and yellowing with age. The pictures were of the treehouse, taken from angles I didn't recognize. There were people in the photos too, but their faces were blurred, distorted in a way that made them look wrong. There were other photographs of the surrounding woods, but they all seemed to have been taken at night. The trees in the pictures had a strange, unnatural stillness to them. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I realized something. The photos were taken in the exact same spot where I had found the key. The treehouse had been built around it as if someone had been watching it for years. Then I heard a noise. A whisper, barely audible. It was faint, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere below the treehouse. I froze, the photographs slipping from my hands as the voice grew louder, more distinct. Leave. Leave now. I backed away, my body frozen in fear. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, there was a rustling above me. My head snapped up, but I saw nothing. Then, there was a tapping on the roof. It was like fingers drumming, slow and deliberate. I couldn't stay there any longer. I scrambled down the ladder, my heart hammering in my chest. As soon as I reached the bottom, I turned and ran for the house, not daring to look back. But I did, and when I did, I saw it. The silhouette of a person standing in the window of the treehouse, watching me. And I knew without a doubt that the face in that window was not mine. The next day, I told my parents what had happened. They were skeptical, thinking it was just my imagination, but when they saw the photographs I had found, their expressions changed. They didn't say much, but I could tell they were disturbed. We never went back to the treehouse again. We moved shortly after that, and I never spoke of it to anyone again. But the images, the voices, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I don't know what was in that treehouse, but whatever it was, it wanted me to find it. I wish I never had. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It started as a simple weekend trip to my aunt's cabin in the woods. My cousins, my brother, and I often spent summers there, and the cabin, though small, was cozy. It was located deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, which was part of the charm. There was something about the isolation that made the whole place feel magical during the day, but eerie when night fell. The treehouse in the woods was something of a legend in our family. My uncle had built it when he was a young man, long before my cousins or I were born. As kids, we'd hear stories about it, how it was the perfect playhouse, high in the trees, a little paradise for children who could climb high enough to reach it. But as the years passed, the treehouse fell into disrepair. It was still there, though, hidden in the woods, far enough from the cabin that it was easy to forget about. But it never really left our imaginations. And every year, someone would mention it, and we'd look at the old treehouse from the cabin window, half curious, half scared to approach it. This particular summer, however, was different. Max, my younger brother, who was 12 at the time, was insistent that we go up to the treehouse. "We should go see it. No one ever does anymore," he said, one evening as we sat around the fire pit. Emily, my older cousin, always the bold one, immediately agreed. She was 17 and constantly pushing us to do things like this. The rest of us were more hesitant. I was 14, and even though I liked adventure, there was something unsettling about the treehouse. I'd heard rumors about it when I was younger. Ghost stories, disappearances, people claiming to have seen things in the trees late at night. It was mostly just kids trying to scare each other, but there was something about the place that didn't sit right with me. "Come on, we're not babies," Emily said, rolling her eyes when she saw the doubt on our faces. "Let's go check it out. What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, the group of us set off, trekking through the woods toward the treehouse. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The air had a thick, musty scent as we walked, a mixture of pine and damp earth. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, as if the woods were absorbing our every step. Eventually, we reached the treehouse. It was perched high in the branches of a massive oak, its wooden walls rotting and covered in vines. The rope ladder that once hung down had long since disintegrated, but the steps were still there, albeit cracked and unstable. A few of the floorboards were missing, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of dread as I stared at the decaying structure. "Well, this is it," Emily said, her voice filled with excitement. "Let's go up." She was already halfway up the ladder before any of us could protest. Max followed her, his curiosity overtaking his fear, and Leo, my younger cousin, who was 9, tried to keep up, but he seemed nervous. I hesitated, looking up at the treehouse, the dark space between the trees feeling almost alive, watching us. "Come on, just go up," Max called down. "It's fine." With a deep breath, I decided to follow them. The steps creaked under my weight, and I could hear my heart pounding as I made my way up. I had to keep my eyes on the ladder because looking around at the darkening woods made my skin crawl. When we reached the top, I stepped into the treehouse, and for a moment, I felt as though I had entered another world. The place was dark, the air thick with mildew. Old furniture sat forgotten in the corners, and there were broken toys scattered across the floor. The windows, though dirty, let in the fading light of the evening, casting eerie shadows across the room. The whole place seemed frozen in time, as though no one had been here in decades. And yet, the more I looked around, the more I realized that something wasn't right. It was quiet, too quiet. The silence felt oppressive, like the air was holding its breath. "This is so cool," Emily said, running her fingers along the dusty windowsill. "Why didn't we come up here sooner?" Max and Leo began exploring, but I stayed near the door, my eyes darting from corner to corner, trying to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "That's it, I'm going up to the loft," Emily announced, heading toward the creaky stairs leading to a small, dark attic space above the main room. I could barely see her as she ascended, and the wood groaned under her weight. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from above, followed by a series of strange scraping noises. "What was that?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt something inside me tighten. It wasn't just the noises that scared me, it was the feeling in the air. The temperature seemed to drop in an instant, and I could feel a pressure building around me, like something was closing in. I had no rational explanation for it, but it was as though the treehouse itself was alive, watching, waiting. Emily's voice broke through the tension. "It's just the old floorboards. Calm down." I wanted to believe her, but deep down I knew something was wrong. "Let's just go back," I said, looking nervously toward the ladder. "This place is off." "Don't be such a baby," Emily said, rolling her eyes again, but she didn't argue for long. A moment later, her face appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression suddenly serious. "There's something up here," she said, her voice hushed. My stomach dropped. "Let's get out of here," I whispered. But Emily, curious as always, was already climbing the rest of the way into the loft. Leo followed her, though, more hesitantly. I stayed rooted to the floor, staring up at the darkness above us. My legs refused to move, as if they understood something I didn't. The seconds dragged on as I waited, my heart thumping in my chest. Then the sound of something scuttling, quick and skittering, echoed from the loft. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air had turned colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. "I don't like this," Max said, stepping closer to me. His face was pale. The next sound I heard was the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the wooden floor. It was coming from above. And then a whisper. "Get out!" I couldn't make out the rest of the words, but they were unmistakably clear. The voice was raspy, strained, like it had been buried for years, perhaps decades. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Emily!" I shouted. "Get down here, now!" But there was no answer. I could hear her moving in the loft, but it didn't sound right. There was something off about her movements, like she wasn't in control of them. She was jerking around, almost as if something was pulling her in different directions. The silence between the sounds was thick, suffocating. Then, in a burst of panic, I heard Emily scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of terror. A scream so sharp it sliced through the air, making my blood run cold. "Emily!" I screamed again, stepping backward toward the ladder. Max was already halfway down, his legs shaking. Leo was frozen in place, unable to move, his eyes wide with fear. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of something crashing to the ground in the loft. I don't remember much after that. My body moved on its own, my mind shutting down in panic. I just ran. We all ran, as fast as we could, not daring to look back. We didn't stop running until we reached the cabin, and when we slammed the door behind us, we stayed inside, trembling. We didn't speak. We couldn't. Emily never came down from the treehouse. We waited in silence, not knowing what had happened, not daring to go back. The night passed, but we didn't sleep. We could still hear the whispers, still feel the pressure in the air. The next morning, when we finally mustered the courage to go back, the treehouse was empty. There was no sign of Emily. We never spoke of that weekend again. Story the end.
Story number 10.
We had always lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone and there are no real secrets. My brother Ethan and I were inseparable growing up. We spent most of our free time outside, exploring the woods, climbing trees, and making up our own adventures. Our parents were the type to let us roam free, trusting us to come back before dark. Our favorite spot in the whole world was a treehouse that Dad had built for us when we were younger. It was small, but it was ours. Tucked high up in an old oak tree at the edge of the property, it was a little sanctuary we could retreat to whenever we wanted to escape. It was the kind of place that felt magical, a place that only existed for us. And for a long time, it was nothing but that, a quiet escape in a world that often felt too big. But one summer, everything changed. I can't say exactly when it started, but I remember the first time I noticed something was wrong. It was a hot afternoon in late June. Ethan and I had just finished playing a game of soccer in the backyard and decided to head up to the treehouse for a break. We had spent hours up there many times before, but this time felt different. It was that gut feeling, the one that told me something was off, but I didn't want to admit it. The sun was starting to set as we climbed the rickety ladder, our feet brushing against the rough bark as we made our way up. The usual sights greeted us, the worn wooden floors, the dusty old blankets we'd left there months ago, and the view of the woods beyond. But there was something else. Something strange. The air in the treehouse felt thicker than usual, almost suffocating. And as we stepped inside, I noticed the small window on the far wall was slightly open. It wasn't open all the way, just a crack, enough to let in a faint breeze, but nothing that would explain the odd feeling in the air. "Did you open the window?" I asked Ethan. He shook his head, his brow furrowed. "No, I thought you did." I glanced around the treehouse, but everything seemed to be in its usual place. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily explain away, but I didn't say anything. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Ethan and I settled in, trying to shake off the odd feeling, but it lingered. We didn't speak much, which was unusual for us. We were always talking, joking around, but now everything felt different, like the treehouse had become a place we didn't belong anymore. And that's when I heard it. A rustling sound. Very faint, but there nonetheless. I tensed up, looking at Ethan to see if he had heard it too. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "You heard that, right?" I nodded, my throat dry. The sound was coming from outside, just beyond the treehouse. It was as if someone or something was moving through the branches, making their way closer to us. We both stood up, moving toward the window to peer out. But there was nothing. Just the darkening woods, swaying gently in the breeze. I tried to laugh it off, but it didn't feel right. We stayed in the treehouse for a little while longer, but the unease never went away. When we finally decided to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something that didn't want us there. As we climbed down the ladder, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the treehouse window, watching us. But there was nothing. The window was closed again, just like it should have been. We didn't talk about it, but the feeling lingered. We avoided the treehouse for the next few days, finding other places to play, but eventually we couldn't stay away for long. Our curiosity got the better of us, and a week later we were back up in the treehouse, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But it wasn't. This time, as we entered, the feeling in the air was even thicker, like a weight pressing down on us. The treehouse felt smaller somehow, more confining. I noticed something else too. The floorboards seemed to creak more than usual, like they were protesting our presence. It was as though the treehouse itself didn't want us there. Ethan was the first to speak. "I don't like this." I didn't either. It was as if everything about the place had changed. The once safe, comforting treehouse now felt like something else entirely. Something dark. I didn't want to stay, but I didn't want to admit to Ethan that I was scared. So we sat down, trying to make ourselves comfortable, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then it happened again. The rustling sound. Louder this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan's face had gone white, and he nodded without speaking. The noise was coming from outside, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the wind or the usual sounds of the woods. It was deliberate. The sounds of footsteps, slow and methodical, moving closer and closer. We both stood up, moving to the window again, our hearts pounding in our chests. But there was nothing there. The woods outside were dark and still, and there wasn't a single movement among the trees. I turned back to the inside of the treehouse, but something caught my eye. A small object on the floor, near the corner. At first, I thought it was just a leaf or a twig that had blown in, but as I stepped closer, I saw that it was something else entirely. A photograph. I bent down to pick it up, feeling an icy chill run through me as I did. The photo was black and white, worn at the edges, as if it had been there for years. In it was a picture of the treehouse, taken from a distance. But there was something off about it. The angle was wrong, and there was a strange figure standing in the shadows just behind the treehouse. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a person, or at least a figure that was shaped like one. My hand trembled as I held the photo, and I turned to Ethan, but he was already backing away, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. We didn't need to say anything else. We both knew. We scrambled down the ladder, not caring about the noise or the risk of falling. When we reached the ground, we didn't look back. We ran into the house, slamming the door behind us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photograph, about the figure in the woods, about the way the treehouse had felt so wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for us. The next morning, we went back to the treehouse, but when we climbed up, everything was different. The window was wide open, and the small latch on the door was unlatched. The floor was covered in fresh dirt, and the air felt thick, suffocating. The photograph was gone, as if it had never existed. We never went back to the treehouse after that day. We moved away not long after, and the house was sold to a new family. But every once in a while, I hear stories about the old place, how the treehouse is still there, standing in the woods, waiting for someone to come back. Some people say it's haunted. Others say it's just a place for kids to play. But I know the truth. That treehouse was never meant to be ours. It was meant to be something else's. Something dark. Something that had been waiting. Story the end.
Story number 11.
It was a warm summer afternoon when my cousins and I decided to venture into the woods behind my grandparents' house. My grandparents lived in a small rural town, tucked away from the nearest city. The house, an old Victorian-style farmhouse, sat on a large piece of land surrounded by dense woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. As children, we spent every summer exploring these woods, playing games, making up stories, and imagining all kinds of adventures. But there was one place in those woods we always avoided: the old treehouse. The treehouse was a relic from my father's childhood. He and my uncles had built it when they were young, but it had long since been abandoned. The last time anyone had used it was probably before I was born. My cousins and I knew about it. We'd seen the large oak tree from the edge of the woods towering above the other trees. From a distance, it looked like a safe, fun place to play. But something about it had always unsettled me. There were rumors about the treehouse. My parents told me stories, though they never went into detail. They would always say that it had been built for fun, but something had happened up there. I never really pressed them for more details. I just accepted the warnings. Don't go near that treehouse. Stay out of the woods after dark. It's best to forget about it. But that day, something in the air felt different. My cousin Sarah, always the adventurous one, insisted we should explore it. We were all in our teens. Sarah was 16, I was 15, my cousin Ben was 14, and my younger brother Ethan, just 10, wanted to tag along. Ethan had been obsessed with the treehouse for years, often asking my parents about it. Of course, they would just give him a stern look and tell him it was just a treehouse that wasn't safe anymore. But that only made Ethan more determined. We were all sitting on the porch, talking about our plans for the day when Sarah brought it up. "Why don't we finally go see the treehouse?" she suggested, her eyes gleaming with mischief. I hesitated. "I don't know. I've always heard weird stuff about it." Ben chimed in, his voice skeptical but intrigued. "We're old enough to handle it, right? It's probably just a bunch of old junk up there." I didn't like the idea, but I didn't want to seem like a coward in front of my cousins. And Ethan, of course, was practically bouncing with excitement. "Please, can we go? Please," Ethan pleaded. I looked at my parents sitting on the porch, but they were deep in conversation and didn't seem to notice what we were planning. I finally nodded. "Fine, but I'm not going first." We gathered our things, nothing special, just some snacks and a flashlight, and headed into the woods. The path was overgrown with weeds, and the further we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, had died down. It was like the woods were holding their breath. After walking for what felt like an hour, we reached the treehouse. It was larger than I had remembered, looming high above us. The oak tree was massive, its trunk wide and gnarled, with thick branches stretching out like arms. The treehouse itself was built on a series of large branches, and the wooden structure looked weathered and fragile, the paint peeling off in large chunks. "I'll go first," Sarah said, stepping up to the base of the tree. She climbed up the rope ladder with ease, her movements swift and sure. I watched, feeling a tight knot form in my stomach. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was waiting up there. "Come on, slowpokes," Sarah shouted from above. "It's fine up here." I reluctantly followed, climbing the ladder behind her. The rungs creaked under my weight, and the treehouse swayed slightly with the wind. When I reached the top, I stepped into the small room. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew filled my nostrils. It looked exactly how I imagined it would. A forgotten place filled with old toys, broken furniture, and scattered remnants of a past long gone. There was a small wooden table in the corner, covered in old newspapers and cobwebs. The windows were cracked, and the light filtering through them gave the room a dim, eerie glow. "See? Not so bad," Sarah said, her voice full of excitement. She was already rummaging through some old crates in the corner, likely looking for something to entertain us. Ben climbed up next, followed by Ethan, who was practically shaking with excitement. "Look at all this stuff!" Ethan exclaimed, picking up an old doll with a cracked face. Let's just check it out and leave, I said, still feeling uneasy. It's getting late, and we should head back soon. But my words were ignored as my cousins continued to explore. I felt out of place, uncomfortable in the stillness of the treehouse. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and every creak of the floorboards sent a chill down my spine. I walked to the window and looked out, scanning the woods below. The trees were dense, and the shadows were growing longer as the sun began to set. "Hey, there's something strange over there," Ben said suddenly, pointing toward the far corner of the treehouse. I turned around to see what he was talking about. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it, a small trapdoor in the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath an old rug. It had been there the whole time, but I hadn't noticed it until now. The wood around the door was dark and stained, as if something had been spilled or dragged across it. "What do you think that is?" Ben asked, walking over to the door. I felt a sudden coldness wash over me, and my stomach twisted. "I don't know. I don't like it. Maybe we should go." But my cousins weren't listening. Ben crouched down and started to pull the rug away from the trapdoor. It was old, rusty, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. With a bit of effort, he managed to pry it open. A dark hole stared back at us, the air around it thick and musty. I could feel a deep sense of unease settle in my chest, but my cousins seemed undeterred. Ben reached into his backpack and pulled out the flashlight, shining it down into the hole. I couldn't see anything at first, but then the beam of light revealed something that made my blood run cold. There, at the bottom of the hole, was an old, weathered box. It looked like a wooden chest, but there was something off about it. The wood was warped, and strange markings were carved into its surface. My first instinct was to turn away, to tell them to close the trapdoor and leave. But before I could speak, Ben reached down and grabbed the box. "Guys, I really don't think we should," I began, but my words were cut off by a loud thump from below. It wasn't a sound I could easily explain. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped, or something had been dragged across the ground. I froze, my blood running cold. My heart was pounding in my ears. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, my throat dry. "We need to go, now." But before any of us could move, the trapdoor slammed shut with a force that shook the entire treehouse. I screamed, stepping back in shock. The room went deathly still, and for a long moment we were all frozen in place. Then the whispering began. It started as a soft murmur, almost like a voice from far away. But as the seconds passed, the whisper grew louder, and I could hear distinct words. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The voice was raspy, guttural, and sounded like it was coming from beneath the floorboards, from deep within the treehouse itself. I could barely breathe. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think of anything to say. Ethan, who had been standing near the trapdoor, suddenly screamed, stumbling back as if something had grabbed him. I reached out to pull him away, but he was shaking uncontrollably. I saw something," he stammered. "Something in the hole. It. Before he could finish, the entire treehouse shook violently, and a gust of wind howled through the cracked windows, rattling the walls. The door to the treehouse burst open with such force that it nearly knocked us all over. The wind was so strong it seemed to be pulling us out of the room. "Go! Go!" I shouted, scrambling toward the door. We rushed down the ladder, this not looking back. The wind was deafening, and I could barely hear my own thoughts over the sound of the branches snapping in the storm. We didn't stop until we were back at my grandparents' house, gasping for breath. That night, as we sat in the living room, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but none of us could explain it. My grandparents didn't say anything when we told them, though I could see the concern in their eyes. They didn't ask us to go back. They didn't have to. We never spoke of the treehouse again, and every time I pass those woods, I can still hear the whispers. Story the end.
Story number 12.
Growing up, I spent every summer at my grandparents' house, which was set far out in the countryside. Their property was expansive, surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles, and it was the kind of place that fueled the imagination. It had all the right ingredients for childhood adventures: old barns, hidden trails, and a mysterious treehouse that had been built by my father and uncles when they were younger. The treehouse was an enigmatic structure. From the ground, it looked inviting, perched high in the limbs of an ancient oak tree, with a rope ladder dangling from the edge. My cousins and I were drawn to it from the moment we could walk, but there was always an air of mystery surrounding it. Adults rarely mentioned it, and when they did, it was with a strange mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. They'd often tell us, "It's just a place for kids to play, but it's been forgotten. Don't go up there." But kids being kids, we had to explore. My cousin Ellie, who was 2 years older than me, was always the leader of our group. She was the one who would climb to the top of the biggest tree, who dared to walk into the darkest woods, and who convinced the rest of us to follow her. The treehouse was her latest obsession. "It's just sitting there, waiting for us," she said one afternoon as the sun started to set behind the trees. "Why haven't we checked it out yet?" I felt a knot form in my stomach, but the idea of not going up there, of letting Ellie down, was worse than the fear itself. Ellie was insistent, so I agreed to join her and my younger brother, Jack. We didn't know it then, but the decision to explore that treehouse would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The first time we approached it, I remember being struck by how much more dilapidated it had become over the years. The once sturdy rope ladder was frayed and rotting, and the wooden walls of the treehouse were now a grayish brown, peeling from years of neglect. It looked almost sad, an abandoned relic of a time gone by. "Come on, don't chicken out now," Ellie said, grinning at me as she grabbed the rope ladder and swung herself up without hesitation. I hesitated for a moment, but followed her up. My feet slipped a couple of times on the frayed rungs, but I eventually made it to the top. Jack was close behind, though he was much more nervous than I was. He had always been the cautious one, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes as he looked around. When I stepped into the treehouse, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a heavy, musty odor that seemed to seep from the very walls. The room inside was dim, only faint light streaming through the cracked windows. There was dust everywhere, on the old furniture, the floor, and even on a few scattered toys that were left behind. The air felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Ellie, as always, was unfazed. She wandered around the room, poking at the remnants of what had once been a fun hangout for children. Jack, however, was sticking close to me, his eyes darting around nervously. "I don't like this," he whispered, his voice tense. "Relax," I whispered back, though I didn't feel much better. Something about the place unsettled me. It felt wrong, like it was too empty, too silent. Even the birds outside seemed to be holding their breath. Ellie ignored us both, going up the creaky stairs to the small loft above. She called down to us, her voice sounding far too cheerful for the atmosphere. "Guys, you have to see this. There's an old chest up here." Against my better judgment, I followed her. The stairs creaked under my feet, and the whole structure seemed to groan in protest, as if it were alive. When I reached the top, I saw Ellie crouched in front of a weathered chest. It looked out of place, as if it had been deliberately tucked away up here. The wooden surface was scuffed and scratched, and there were strange carvings on the lid. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped closer. "Do you think it's locked?" Ellie asked, trying to pry the lid open. "I don't know. I think it's been here for years," I replied, my unease growing. Jack had stayed at the bottom of the stairs, still clutching the railing with a nervous look on his face. Suddenly, the air in the treehouse seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Ellie paused in her efforts to open the chest, her face turning pale. For the first time, she looked unsure of herself. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. At first, I didn't, but then I heard it too. A low, scraping sound from somewhere below, as if something heavy was being dragged across the ground. It sent a jolt of fear through my chest. "What was that?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, though I had a sinking feeling I did. Ellie glanced nervously over the side of the treehouse as if expecting to see something or someone below. But there was nothing. The woods were still and quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's go down and check it out." But Ellie didn't move. Instead, she looked down at the chest again. There was something different about her expression now. The playful excitement had drained from her face, replaced by an almost desperate curiosity. "I just need to open it," she muttered, more to herself than to us. Before I could stop her, Ellie yanked the chest open. The lid creaked loudly, and a thick, sour smell hit my nostrils. It was the same musty, damp odor that seemed to have soaked into the very walls of the treehouse. I recoiled, but Ellie didn't seem to notice. She reached inside and pulled out a bundle of old, tattered clothes. But they weren't just clothes. They were wrapped around something hard and heavy. "Ellie, stop!" I shouted, my heart racing. But it was too late. She had already unwrapped the bundle, and inside was a small wooden box. The box was intricately carved, its surface covered in strange symbols that looked almost wrong. As Ellie held it up, the room seemed to grow colder, and I swear I felt a shadow flicker across the walls. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, a soft murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The words were indistinguishable, but they were unmistakably there. The whispers were growing louder, circling around us like a storm. "Ellie," I said, my voice shaky. "Put it down. Now." But Ellie didn't respond. She was staring at the box, her face pale and distant. Her hands were trembling, and I could see a strange look in her eyes, almost as if she wasn't herself anymore. Suddenly, the treehouse shuddered. The floor beneath us groaned in protest, and the walls seemed to creak, as if something were trying to break free from within. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. The whispers grew into a shrill, desperate cry, and the room felt like it was closing in on us. The box in Ellie's hands seemed to pulse, as though something inside it was alive, struggling to break free. Without thinking, I grabbed Jack's arm and pulled him toward the ladder. I had no idea what was happening, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. We rushed down the ladder as fast as we could, with Ellie trailing behind us, still clutching the box. But when we reached the bottom, we turned to find Ellie frozen at the top of the ladder. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and the box was gone from her hands. She screamed. A figure emerged from the darkness of the treehouse, a shadowy shape that seemed to float in the air. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched out like branches. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the glint of eyes staring at us. Cold, empty eyes. Ellie screamed again, but it was cut off as if something had gripped her throat. She was pulled backward up into the treehouse, her body jerking as if she was being dragged by some unseen force. I could do nothing but watch in horror as she disappeared into the darkness of the treehouse. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The treehouse was silent once more. We never saw Ellie again. We ran back to the house, terrified and shaking, but when we told our parents what had happened, they didn't believe us. They said it was just our imagination, that we were probably just scared by an animal or the wind. But I know what I saw. I know what happened that day. Ellie was gone, and the treehouse still stands, waiting for the next group of children foolish enough to disturb what lies inside. Story the end.
Story number 13.
I grew up in a small town on the outskirts of a dense forest. The kind of place where the neighbors were close enough to know each other's business, but far enough apart that you could find solitude. Our house sat on the edge of a large piece of land, bordered by a thick line of trees that stretched far into the horizon. My older brother Kyle and I spent most of our childhood outside, exploring the woods, climbing trees, and generally making our own fun. We were the kind of kids who didn't need much more than a handful of sticks, an old rope, and a tree to create an entire world of adventure. One summer, when I was around 12 and Kyle was 14, our dad built us a treehouse in the largest oak tree at the far end of the yard. It was our pride and joy. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a small wooden platform with walls, a few windows, and a rickety ladder leading up to it. But to us, it was the best thing in the world. We spent every free minute in it, reading, playing, and daydreaming about everything and nothing at all. It became our little sanctuary, a place we could escape from the real world. But as time went on, things started to change. Slowly at first, it was subtle, a small noise in the night, a flicker of movement in the corner of our eyes. Nothing alarming, but enough to make us feel uneasy. It started with Kyle. One afternoon, I came back from riding my bike to find him sitting at the base of the tree, staring up at the treehouse. His face was pale, his eyes wide, almost like he had seen a ghost. "Hey, what's wrong?" I asked, worried. Kyle didn't respond immediately. He just kept staring up at the treehouse, his gaze fixed on the small window where we used to sit and look out. Finally, he turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like it up there anymore." I frowned. "What do you mean? It's just a treehouse, Kyle." "No, you don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "I keep feeling like someone's watching me when I'm up there." I didn't know what to say. I'd spent countless hours in that treehouse and had never felt anything other than peace. "You're just imagining things," I told him. "There's nothing to worry about." But Kyle was insistent. Over the next few weeks, he refused to go up into the treehouse. He'd sit at the base of the tree or play in the yard. But no matter how many times I asked him to join me, he wouldn't. He'd always come up with an excuse or say he didn't feel like it. At first, I thought it was just a phase. Maybe he was going through a rebellious stage, or maybe he was just too old for tree houses. But then things got stranger. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, I decided to climb up to the treehouse by myself. I had a book in my hand, and I figured it would be a good place to read for a while. As I reached the top of the ladder and stepped onto the platform, I felt it. A chill in the air. It wasn't the kind of chill you get from the wind or the cold. It was something different. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I brushed it off as nothing more than my imagination running wild. I settled into the corner of the treehouse and opened my book. But as I read, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the treehouse. Nothing had changed. The same old blankets, the same wooden floor. But then I saw it. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just the movement of the leaves outside, casting strange patterns on the walls. But this shadow was different. It was too solid, too defined. It moved in a way that didn't match the wind, and it seemed to be coming from the far corner of the treehouse, near the small window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow didn't move like a person, but it was unmistakable. It was as if something was standing there, just out of sight, watching me. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. But before I could react, the shadow shifted. It moved closer to me. My heart skipped a beat, and I jumped to my feet. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shape, just empty space. I was alone. I ran out of the treehouse as fast as I could, nearly tripping on the ladder. When I hit the ground, I didn't stop to look back. I ran into the house, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving with fear. I didn't tell Kyle about what happened that night. I didn't know how to explain it, but I didn't go back to the treehouse for days. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other strange things. Footsteps in the yard when no one was around. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the direction of the treehouse at night. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or animals, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One afternoon, I decided to check the treehouse again, just to see if anything had changed. Kyle was inside, watching TV, and I figured I'd go alone. As I climbed the ladder, I noticed something odd. There were new marks on the walls. Scratches, like something had been clawing at them. I stepped into the treehouse, my heart racing. The marks were all over the place, as though something had been trying to get in, or something had been trapped inside. I reached for the old blanket we kept in the corner, but as my hand brushed it, I froze. The blanket wasn't there. Instead, there was something else. A small, dirty piece of fabric, like a torn shirt, lying in the corner. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I saw it. There was a message written in the dirt on the floor, just beneath the window. "Leave now." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at those words. My stomach churned, and the air around me seemed to grow heavier. I had no idea who had written that or why, but I knew one thing. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was in that treehouse with me. I ran out of the treehouse without looking back. My mind was racing, and my hands shook as I tried to steady myself. I couldn't understand what was happening. Who would do something like that? And why? The next day, I told Kyle everything. I showed him the message, the torn fabric walls. Mark said of being scared. Kyle just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been hearing things at night. Voices, whispering. Sometimes I hear scratching, like someone's trying to get inside the house." His words hit me like a punch, to the gut. I had never heard him talk like that before. I had always thought I was the one who was scared of the dark, of things I couldn't explain. But now, I wasn't so sure. We decided together that we wouldn't go back to the treehouse. It didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like something else's, something dark and menacing. A few weeks later, we moved away. The house was sold and the treehouse was left behind. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, the scratching sounds, and the feeling of being watched. I don't know what was in that treehouse, but I know this. It wasn't meant for us. And I'll never forget the terror that took root in that place. Story the end.